Pınar, when you say we're good to go, then we might begin. So
Go
I'm
ahead,
waiting for you.
Hocam.
Okay.
Okay. We can go ahead and start, Hocam.
Okay. Hello, everyone, and welcome to Atlas Grad Institute's exclusive seminar on the start of a new future, a look into where international relations stand post-2020 US elections. I'm Özüm Arzık Erzurumlu. I work as an assistant professor in the Department of Translation and Interpreting at Atlas University. Moreover, I'm a professional conference interpreter, having had the opportunity to interpret the American presidential debates and the last three American presidents. And I would like to open up with a quote from Charles Dickens's A Tale of Two Cities. It was the best of times. It was the worst of times. It was the age of wisdom. It was the age of foolishness. It was the epoch of belief. It was the epoch of incredulity. It was the season of light. It was the season of darkness. It was the spring of hope. It was the winter of despair. We had everything before us. We had nothing before us. We were all going direct to heaven. We were all going direct the other way. In short, the period was so far like the present period that some of its noisiest authorities insisted on its being received for good or for evil in the superlative degree of comparison only. Drawing on this quote, the times that we live in and the times that US experiences is what we will explore today. The last 4 years contained so many world-changing, paradigm-shifting developments. With the awakening events of trial hearings, new shifts within foreign policy, and a global pandemic on the rise, there are many unanswered questions as to what will happen in the next 4 years under the President-elect Joe Biden's regime. In this seminar, we will take a stock of the results of the 2020 US presidential elections and discuss what is in store for international relations. In an attempt to look into the new era in US, we have distinguished guests with us. It's my honor to introduce Mr. Ambassador Thomas Pickering. Ambassador Pickering is a retired ambassador. He served as US ambassador to the Russian Federation, India, Israel, Nigeria, and Jordan. He also was the US ambassador and representative to the United Nations in New York. In honor of Ambassador Pickering, the U.S. Department of State Foreign Affairs Fellowship Program was renamed Thomas R. Pickering Foreign Affairs Fellowship Program, and he currently is a vice chair of Hills and Company. Thank you for accepting our invitation, sir. We have Ambassador John Barry. Ambassador John Barry served as the 25th U.S. Ambassador and President Obama's personal representative to Australia from 2013 to 2016. In 2016, he was named President of the American Australian Association. And prior to that, Ambassador Barry also served as Deputy Assistant Secretary and acted as Assistant Secretary for Law Enforcement in the U.S. Treasury Department, as a Senior Policy Advisor at the Smithsonian Institution, as Assistant Secretary for Policy, Management, and Budget at the U.S. Department of Interior. Thank you for accepting our invitation, sir. We have Professor Stephen David with us. Professor Stephen David is a professor of international relations in Johns Hopkins University, and his work focuses on security issues, the politics of the developing world, American foreign policy, and turmoil in the Middle East. Professor David's scholarship emphasizes the impact of internal politics and foreign policy, particularly among developing countries. Thank you for accepting our invitation, sir. And we have Richard Fontaine. Richard Fontaine is currently the Chief Executive Officer of the Center for a New American Security. Prior to CNAS, he was Foreign Policy Advisor to Senator John McCain and worked at the State Department, the National Security Council, and on the staff of the Senate Foreign Relations Committee. Mr. Fontaine began his foreign policy career as a staff member of the Senate Foreign Relations Committee, focusing on the Middle East and Southeast Asia. Thank you for being with us, Mr. Richard Fontaine. So let's get started with the first question. In today's panel, we will look into two broad topics. First, we will look into the global leadership of US, and next we're going to look into the foreign policy, and I'm sure we will benefit hugely from the experience of our distinguished speakers. As Americans process the results of a historic election, There are many pressing foreign policy questions facing the next administration. What impact would have a divided government between Congress, Senate, and the White House have on US foreign policy? And with Trump admins remaining a powerful political force, can we expect a return to the traditional US leadership? And how do you see the global leadership of the US? So let's get started with you, Mr. Ambassador Thomas Pickering. Thomas Pickering, the floor is yours, sir.
Thank you very much, and I'm delighted to join such a distinguished panel, and in some ways have a bit of trepidation with their experience and knowledge. But let me begin by saying that while the election results are not finally ratified by the president, they appear clearly to be moving pretty firmly toward Mr. Biden. And while we can discuss that in great detail, let me skip over that and make the assumption that this will be a Biden presidency. Secondly, you point out the fact that divisions don't disappear with American elections. Sometimes they become starker and obviously more salient and more cogent. We don't know the answer to that. It's very clear that Biden, in his initial statements, has sought to find a way to unify the country. And he is, by tradition, particularly his long service in the Senate, and by that reputation, a unifier. He will try hard to do it, but words do not produce unity, actions do. And interestingly enough, he has spoken early about an opportunity to speak with the present majority leader of the Senate, Mitch McConnell from Kentucky, as a way to begin, and we hope that he can. It will not be easy. We have not seen polarization in American political attitudes like this, perhaps since even the Civil War, which divided the country and led to secession. It is a very important and significant and challenging period. US leadership will depend more on unity than division, and division will subtract from it. As well, past history over the last 4 years and even before, certainly the period of George W. Bush was not one that brought great sense of competence to American leadership. Obama tried to recover, but it was a long, hard slog. But it proved that recovery from division is not something that comes automatically as a result of an election, like a coin producing a result in a slot machine. It is trying and taxing and difficult. A final point. In this very difficult set of circumstances, the Biden administration will have an agenda replete with items which in one way or another will lead to division. Certainly in the domestic sphere, one only has to note the hard differences over, over healthcare. In the foreign policy area, there will be questions about meeting the exigencies of the trifecta of the virus, of economic depression, and of racial differences. There will be certainly real problems in meeting the contestants in the sphere, particularly China and perhaps Russia. There will be major divisions over the Middle East and what to do about Iran, although it appears that Biden at least would like to rejoin the JCPOA, perhaps with no changes as a way to proceed, but that will not happen easily in the United States. And there are Democrats who in one way or another remain deeply suspicious of Iran. So all of this adds up to a multiple series of problems, undoing much of what has been done by the Trump administration, facing new problems, recognizing a changed world situation from 4 years ago does not permit an automatic reset to January 21st, the year that Obama left office. A big challenge. We don't know yet whether Biden and his team will be to it. One hopes they are, but there is no certainty. And final point, it is not easy to fill positions in the US government with new appointees. And particularly if the Senate were to stay divided as it is now, that will be even harder. So it is for Biden perhaps as big a Abraham Lincoln faced, and perhaps in one sense or another, unfortunately, likely to lead to discourse, and some feel perhaps even violence. I wish I could be more positive and more optimistic. The outcome of the election shows promise, but enormous challenges.
Thank you very much, sir. So I will ask the same question to Ambassador John Barry.
Thank you, Zoom, and thank you, Ambassador Pickering. I think the ambassador uh, gave a very succinct and very accurate description of where we stand. And I don't disagree with anything that he said. I think I would just underscore one thing. It's it's interesting when President Biden made his calls to a number of international leaders this past week. Um, he listed as his first job and most important job containing COVID and future global threats. His second was confronting climate change. The third was laying a groundwork for a global economic recovery. Fourth, strengthening democracy. And fifth, maintaining secure and prosperous Indo-Pacific region. That one more specific to his call to Australia and Japan. But those first four, you know, Ambassador Pickering captured in as priorities that this administration is going to have to wrestle with. The unspoken priority uh, uh, is clearly the most important job that Joe Biden will face in his term as president will be to try to bridge the amazing divide that has deepened and widened in our country. As Ambassador Pickering said quite correctly, maybe not this deep since, you know, the middle of the 1800s. And you know, though it wasn't listed in his calls as one of his priorities, I think Joe Biden is keenly aware that not one of, but his most important priority will be to begin to unite the country and to try to find ways to bridge that divide. Will it be easy? Absolutely not. It's going to be challenging, and I predict it will be in fits and in starts. But I do take great comfort in one thing. I know President Biden. I think he is an outstanding individual of highest integrity, and he is a unifier. It's his core nature. It is, if, as many of us who speak often, you know, you always have your home base, where to go back to. Joe Biden's home base is to be a unifier. And so, you know, our country has before in difficult times had the amazing, whether one would call foresight or luck, in selecting leaders that can rise to the challenges of the time. And with uniting the country being the main challenge, because I agree entirely. I think Ambassador Pickering said it very well, where if we're unified, the United States leadership in the global arena will be much stronger. To the extent we're divided, you know, just subtract that from our global influence. And so, you know, the country, not the country and the world need the United States to find ways to build trust, to build these bridges between this deep and wide rift that has grown up in our country. So the good news is I think Joe Biden has the skill set to do that. And hopefully the times will inspire sufficient people to work with him.
Thank you, Mr. Ambassador. Mr. Stephen David, could you please elaborate on the same question?
I agree with what my distinguished panelists have said. Let me just add a couple of things. Even if the Republicans hold on to control of the Senate, there's a lot of President Biden can do, even with Senate opposition. He can, as he said he intended to do, rejoin the Paris Climate Accords, which is a major move, to rejoin the Iran nuclear deal. also very important. To extend the New START Treaty. The START Treaty is the only significant arms control treaty between us and Russia, and the Trump administration had indicated it was going to let it lapse. I mean, restarting that is a big, big deal. So the president has a fair amount of autonomy in foreign policy, far more than in domestic politics. And steps like these will make an immediate and an important contribution. Equally important is tone. I mean, we're going to have a very different style of rhetoric from President Biden. It's not going to be shoot from the hip, populist appeal, trying to divide Americans and divide the world. And that's going to, I think, have an important tangible effect. And his approach is going to be also different. He's going to have a multilateral approach. He's going to welcome our allies, reassert our commitment to NATO, make it clear that the United States doesn't want to have America first again. And that's going to be a big difference. And finally, let me say that although I would prefer the Senate to flip to the Democratic side, which is still a possibility, however remote. A divided Senate or a Republican-led Senate isn't all bad. As you suggest, we are a divided country. The election is pretty close to 50-50. So having a government that reflects the wishes and passions and attitudes of the American public isn't all a negative thing. It's more reflective of the political reality we have to live with, and that that may again not be all bad, and perhaps temper some of the more extreme elements in the Democratic Party.
Thank you very much, sir. Richard Fontaine, the floor is yours. The same question, please.
Thanks, and thanks for having all of us for this session. During your introduction, you said that you translated the presidential debates, and I thought to the first presidential debate that we had of this season, and the effort to try to translate that must have been a feat of Olympian proportions. And it also gets to a bit of the craziness of the political atmosphere that is obtained in the United States this year and over the past few years. And for all of the divisions in American society and in the political system, and the fact that we're quite probably looking at divided government with a Republican Senate and a Democratic House closely divided and a Democrat in the White House, I'm actually fairly optimistic that we'll see at least some improvement compared to where we have been over the past 4 years, simply because the personalities will change. I had the opportunity, as others have, to see Joe Biden up close when I worked for 7 years as a staffer in the U.S. Senate. And his tone is quite different than Donald Trump's, to say the least. But there's another thing beyond the tone, and that is that Joe Biden is a deal maker. He has shown an ability to cut deals and to put himself in the political place mentally of the other folks that he's dealing with, which I think will serve the country well, both domestically in terms of deals and agreements between the Congress and the White House, but also internationally. Because a lot of successful foreign policy stems from being able to cut deals, including with those with whom you don't fully agree. So I'm not utopian about the era to come, but I think ultimately it's a good outcome that we will probably have a Republican Senate and a Democrat and Joe Biden in the White House. And I think there's possibilities there, possibilities on China policy for sure, which is an area of broad agreement between the parties, even though there's differences on priorities and to some degree on tone. I think there's broad agreement that the United States is in a competitive relationship with China, and that part of the answer to that is to be stronger domestically, to increase the sources of strength, whether it's innovation, economics, technology, and certainly military. There's opportunities there on NATO and Russia policy. There are opportunities to coordinate and cooperate there. And then on the biggest issue of them all, which is COVID, I think hopefully we can look forward to an era where we get beyond ridiculous political debates about whether it's good or bad to wear a mask, or if COVID is a hoax or not, and move into what do we actually do about this, given that it's out of control in the United States, but that there's a vaccine here around the corner, hopefully, and that there's a major impulse that we need to follow to work with other countries internationally, because we're not going to be safe in the United States from this until there's a global solution. And that means getting vaccines distributed to countries, including poor countries around the world that have trouble with distribution networks and so forth. So there's a huge amount of work to be done just to return to something approaching normal functioning of our societies and our economies. And there, I think we hopefully can look forward to some level of cooperation rather than just a pattern of confrontation.
Thank you, Mr. Fontaine. So you dwelled on the Chinese-American relationship. Moving on with that, I'd like to ask Mr. David, because as far as I know, currently you're working on a book that focuses on the emerging Sino-American, that is American-Chinese competition. And you argue that this competition will play a greater role in determining global peace and stability. And could you please elaborate on that? What are the dynamics of the current strategic rivalry, and what may be the resulting consequences for international politics? Mr. David.
Sure. Well, I agree with Richard Fontaine that there is bipartisan agreement that China presents a threat to American interests. The threat is somewhat first geopolitical. You have a rising China confronting an existing hegemon, the United States, and historically that's led to trouble. There's an ideological dispute. The United States is a free market democracy. China believes in a managed economy, one-party rule. There are concerns about human rights, especially China's treatment of the Uyghurs, what's going on now in Hong Kong, the issues over Taiwan, trade, technology, the South China Sea. These are not going to go away with a Biden presidency. I mean, these are structural disputes that are going to continue to bedevil the competition between America and China. And I think it's fair to say that many Americans who worked on Chinese policy, who had hoped to see a change in the Chinese approach, perhaps a move more towards democratization, towards more constructive participation in world affairs, have been disappointed. So the competition, the conflict will continue with the Biden presidency. But again, I think there will be a change in tone and approach. It won't be this sort of in-your-face conflict, this transactional disputes that we had with the Trump administration, and a recognition that America and China need to cooperate if we're going to deal with many of the problems that we all face, whether it be climate change, COVID, terrorism, issues in North Korea. And what we have to learn to do is confront China where it conflicts with American interests, but also to be open to cooperating with China where both countries can benefit. And I think the Biden administration will be much better poised to take advantage of the certainly cooperative relationship than we had with the Trump administration.
Thank you very much. Mr. Pickering, Mr. Ambassador Pickering, based on your experience, would you like to elaborate on the foreign relations of the US? How do you think the foreign relations with China, with Israel will be impacted?
Well, I agree with what Professor David has said. I think we have a tendency in the United States to look at relations either as good or bad along a continuum where we gravitate toward the ends. The continuum with China is, on the one hand, a military threat of gigantic proportions driven by a thesis of world domination in which we need to be prepared for conflict, which for some is inevitable. This supports military budgeting. It supports people whose conservative ideas are out there. It is not unrealistic to believe that China and the United States are in contention. That's real. The other end of the continuum is closer to what Professor David said. Even if we have differences and we need to push back, we need to keep diplomatic lines of communications open. And I believe leaning toward that end of the spectrum, if we can find issues on which each of us agree we have an existential problem, like climate change, we can then use that solutions to existential problems jointly arrived at, but with the rest of the world with us, as a basis for proceeding on. It tends to reduce the second order problems which bring conflict to us and hopefully can bring out a solution over a period of time. It was very much the Cold War segue of the United States, particularly after the Cuban Missile Crisis, but beginning with President Kennedy, toward arms control and disarmament, seeking to find a way to prevent a nuclear catastrophe by accident, miscalculation, or misjudgment. That being said, it is important for us, I believe, to both understand China very, very well, but at the same time, to seek to build a relationship which will not be what it was 10 years ago, but will in many cases test the notion that we are in a contest which is a duel to the death over world hegemony. I think finally, it is very important for the United States as it thinks about these problems to recognize that much of what we support with respect to China, we cannot implement. We don't change foreign governments and we don't change regimes. And some of that is recognition as well that in advocating human rights, we have much to do in our own country. In advocating more open markets and free market capitalism, we see in many ways the US government does play a balancing and regulatory role in our own economy between absolute efficiency, which may be a product of believing in Adam Smith, but also social justice, which is clearly a moral and significant responsibility in our own terms. You asked about Israel. Israel is, for the United States, both our closest friend and ally, and clearly a developing challenge. My experience in Israel has been that Israeli voters will have a tendency to support a conservative government, particularly in times of uncertainty. And uncertainty for Israel is replete in a situation where there is no peace. There are great differences, I believe, between many in the United States and the current Israeli government over what are the conditions and the terms for a peaceful settlement. So broadly divided that I believe the Trump proposals in this regard will not be very useful in solving the problem, and we have to go back to square one. So massively eclipsed under present circumstances by the replete generation of new problems in the Middle East in the last decade, that in many ways, Israel-Palestinian peace arrangements have in fact been sublimated to a much lower priority in the Middle East, something that has pleased Prime Minister Netanyahu's government, and something that in one way or the another, the United States, for a host of very complicated reasons having to do with our own domestic politics and the role of the Jewish American community in those, and the influence of Israel to a place and a time where our prescriptions have either become pretty much a ratification of Prime Minister Netanyahu's ideas, or alternatively so timid and so tepid as to be unrealistic. If indeed, as I believe, the future of Israel in the long term depends on peace in the area, and peace in the area, despite the note that it can't mean more to us than it does to the parties, has in many ways been generated in large measure by US influence and leadership, which has declined. So the challenge here is, can we be, put it this way, able in a balanced way to reestablish some position in the region? In the long term, I believe totally devoted to the presence and preservation of a relationship with Israel, but on a basis where the region itself has come to that conclusion, not through brute force on either side, but for the terribly challenging and difficult process of negotiations in which our weight on the scales has to be felt, but in my view, not perceived as a gigantic form of diktat. This is a foreign policy problem of the first order, and not one that's going to be easily taken on, much less easily resolved, but it is out there, and it is in some ways still as an important question in the Middle East, not totally dismissible and not really dead. And my final conclusion is that whatever one may think about the death of the two-state solution, the alternatives have not appeared in any way at all that are respectable competitors. And we are left, as Winston Churchill once said about democracy, with the two-state solution as the least worst on the board.
Thank you very much, Mr. Ambassador. You summarized the relations with Israel and China. And you also said that there is a division with regard to climate change between China and America. So moving on with that, my question is to you, Mr. Ambassador John Berry. President Trump announced that the US will be leaving Paris Climate Agreement, which is a first in history. And now President-elect Biden is stating that US will rejoin after he comes into office next year. How do you think US will maintain its stance as a global leader in terms of climate change? And do you think the Biden administration will revert the tide? Ambassador Berry.
Thank you, Azum. If I could just begin, excuse me, to back up just a moment before I answer the climate change question to the previous question. One of the great, no administration is pure wrong or pure right. No one has all the answers. And one of the places that I believe the Trump administration has made good progress, and it's an interesting response to some of the discussion that Professor David and Ambassador Pickering were having regarding China. Just 4 short years ago, our State Department wouldn't, use the word Asia Pacific. And the Trump administration has moved that word to Indo-Pacific. In all of the existing Biden discussions and paper that I've seen, they have picked up that term. So I don't think we're going backwards to the Asia Pacific. I think that was a step forward. But that will mean a lot of things in terms of diplomacy and in terms of international relations. And one of the great progresses that's happened, and Ambassador Pickering knows more about India than I have, has forgotten more about India than I'll ever learn. But just last week, there was an exercise called Exercise Malabar, which was a military exercise that united the United States, India, Japan, and Australia in a quadrilateral training exercise. Now, I think Ambassador Pickering might agree with me that the probability of that occurring during his term when he was ambassador to India or even as recent as when I was ambassador to Australia, um, those were dreams and hopes, never a reality. The fact that it has happened and is moving in that direction is a real reflection of sort of international response to the increasing assertiveness, and in many cases, as India is faced with China, increasing aggressiveness of the Chinese footprint in the international arena. So I think it's an interesting thing to highlight points where the current administration has done some good work and deserves good credit. Now, turning to your question on climate change, I think you'll remember the 4 points I pointed out that President-elect Biden made in his calls to foreign leaders. Climate change was number 2, so it is very important. It second only to containing COVID and its outbreak around the world. So I think 4 quick points on this. I think first, the president keenly understands the criticality of this issue, that this is an existential threat to the planet and humanity, not just a national threat. It is a threat that affects all of us. It affects weather. It affects the ability to grow crops. It affects water. It affects so many issues, and it is amidst us now. This is not something that's coming 10 years, 20 years, 30 years from now. It is happening now. And you're seeing this play out in water shortages and changing weather patterns and changing storm patterns. So the criticality of it, I think, is fully appreciated by this president. I think he will be advised strongly by John Kerry, my former boss as Secretary of State. And, no one is more passionate and more skilled and capable on this issue than him. And I think he will play a major role in the Biden administration in terms of advancing both our return to the Paris Agreement, but really, in my opinion, the Paris Agreement is not enough. The Paris Agreement was nice 4 years ago. If we don't do more than the Paris Agreement, we will fail. And so we need to be looking beyond the Paris Agreement. And I think people like John Kerry will be doing just that. The third reason I think is so important is the President Biden sees climate change as a huge opportunity for innovation and for economic growth. One of the challenges, whoever was president, whatever party, is creating well-paying jobs for the next generation, creating a middle class that has an income level that can support their children and their assist in education, et cetera. And this is the first generation where that is in question for Americans, and it leads to that's one of the undertow effects that are affecting our polarization. Is this the lack of the security of good paying jobs for the middle class. And, I think President Biden has seen, you can see where this is an area where China has roared ahead of us in terms of economic production and international sales. The proof is there that this is a huge market. This is a huge source of income. The United States is doing pretty good. We need to do a lot better, and we will. And I think President Biden will restore that focus. And I think on all areas of, whether you think wind, solar, innovation, of next generation of all of these items is going to bring great economic growth and great economic job potential with it. So I think that's a very important aspect to think just domestically, a domestic benefit for the United States out of the president-elect's response to climate change. And then finally, I think it goes back to what Professor David was saying, and Ambassador Pickering and Richard, that, look, the United States is going to be more engaged on a multilateral level. We are not going to be I would call the past 4 years, if there was a name for the book, it would be the international book, it'd be The Binary Solution. They have seen things at, two at a time. And there are obvious limitations to that approach, especially for complicated issues like climate change. And a multilateral response is mandatory in this situation. So this will be one of the primary pathways, I believe, that the United States can return to its multilateral role, its multilateral leadership, not just engagement, but also leadership, and assist. We should have as many tools in the toolbox as we can have, and multilateral engagement is one of those tools. I'm not saying it's the only one, but it is a great one to have, and climate change will be one that will be the leading issue to bring us back into it. I apologize for the length of my answer.
Thank you very much for your insightful remarks. So as far as I understand, you believe that the Green New Deal of Joe Biden will be materialized in the near future. That's my understanding of it, right? The Green New Deal.
Well, I want to be careful, and President-elect Biden was very careful. The Green New Deal has a lot of things in it that appeal to the far left and the progressive community, and those are not going to be a high priority of moving forward. But the portions of the Green New Deal that make good common sense, that the strong center of the United States can rally around, it could be one of those bridges. In fact, let's come up with a new name. Let's leave the name Green New Deal behind us. President Biden's energy strategy will be a much more effective and a potential bridge. And going back to that initial point, which Ambassador Pickering and I are saying, how critical it is to build as many of those bridges across the divide in our country as we can. So, things like fracking and natural gas production are going to continue, all through Joe Biden's term and beyond. They're critical in terms of a transition. But trust me, tax credits and incentivization and, the business development and growth for solar, for wind, for wave, for potential advances that are being made in nuclear and in fusion, all offer hope, all offer the prospect of economic jobs. And that's where President-elect Biden's energy strategy is going to bring those together. And every one of them will be focused on trying to help address the challenge of climate change as well.
Thank you very much for renaming, because I still remember that term from the presidential debates. As you might remember, it was one of the hot topics. That's why I wanted to elaborate on it. And thank you very much for clarifying this point. Thank you. And let's move on with Richard Fontaine. Mr. Fontaine, Southeast Asia is one of the fastest growing and most dynamic regions in the world. And the fact remains that the US-Southeast Asia relations under the Trump administration started off on a rocky footing with the United States' withdrawal from Trans-Pacific Partnership. And what will be the new administration's approach to US-Southeast Asia relations in terms of economic integration and transnational challenges? And you might also elaborate on the previous questions as well, if you would like to. Thank you.
Great. Well, I'll say a word about the US-China relationship that our colleagues were speaking about before. And the Trump administration has taken a more competitive and confrontational line with China. And I think there's broad consensus among Republicans and Democrats that a more competitive relationship is on order, that there's not going to be a return to the previous policy of engagement with China that was premised, at least in part, on hopes that that engagement would change Chinese behavior over time, that China would become a more responsible stakeholder in the international system, that it may even lead to liberalization or democratization at home over time because of trade and information engagement and so forth. And I think those days are over. And so we are headed to a more competitive relationship by far, no matter who the president is. Here, though, I might be a little more pessimistic than my colleagues about the nature of cooperation between Beijing and Washington. I mean, it is, of course, true that there are issues in which both Beijing and Washington will have an interest, and that could be the fodder for potential cooperation. Coronavirus is the top one right now. Neither the United States nor China has any interest in coronavirus continuing to spiral out of control. We both have an interest in containing the virus, and yet there's no cooperation at all today on coronavirus. And you could say that's only because it's Donald Trump rather than Joe Biden in the presidency, but I suspect that the problems are deeper than that. Similarly, on climate change, potentially on nonproliferation or some arms control issues, there's other opportunities to North Korea. There's other opportunities to cooperate, but the pattern of relations between the U.S. and China has shown that it's hard to just segment issues and cooperate fully in this area while competing fiercely in this other area. And so while conceptually it's possible that the relationship is just a mixture of cooperation and competition, and we've carried that off successfully in the past with other countries, in practice, it may be very difficult to compete really fiercely and not let that competition, that sense of rivalry, infect the spirit of cooperation in other areas. It just remains to be seen whether both of those can be done at the same time, or whether there are going to be choices about whether to dampen either the competitive nature of some elements of the relationship or the cooperative nature of some of the other ones. And so we'll see when a Biden administration tries to compete and cooperate simultaneously, whether this is as possible as I think we hope. On Southeast Asia, you know, the way in which Southeast Asia policy is shaping up is in the context of this broader competition with China, not exclusively, but in large part, and over the role of the U.S. presence across the Indo-Pacific. The United States is increasing its close ties with countries in, its 5 treaty allies in the Indo-Pacific, but also with partners like India and Vietnam and Singapore and Indonesia and others. The big question, I think, for the Biden administration when it comes to Southeast Asia is going to be on the economic side. And that is, what does U.S. economic leadership in the region look like? I think that the administration will continue the efforts both on the diplomatic and the military side to increase American presence and activity and sort of build out networking of like-minded countries. That's already starting to happen. Ambassador Berry talked about the Malabar exercise recently. Diplomatically, there's the Quad grouping of US, India, Japan, and Australia, but they've added on in informal ways some of the Southeast Asian countries. But the real question is on the economic side. What does economic leadership look like in the Indo-Pacific, and particularly for the countries of Southeast Asia? Joe Biden was one of the top people advocating for the Trans-Pacific Partnership agreement when the Obama administration negotiated it, and then it was before Congress, but it didn't pass. And then, as we all know, Donald Trump withdrew from it. I'm pretty pessimistic that the Biden administration will come back in and just announce that it will get back into TPP. I personally would love to see that. But I think the politics of that have shifted, and it's just a lot harder than it used to be. So if TPP is not on the table, then what takes its place? And that, I think, is going to be the big question mark for the administration to have to answer.
Thank you very much, sir, for your insightful remarks. And we will move on with Stephen David. As far as I know, you study the relationship between Israel and America, and maybe you could also elaborate on the future US-Israeli relations. And you could also elaborate on the previous questions as well, based on your experience. Thank you, sir.
Okay. I'm in fundamental agreement with Ambassador Pickering's remarks on U.S. and Israel. Ambassador Pickering and I may be a part of a dwindling group. Maybe it's just down to us two, who believe that a two-state solution is really the only solution for Israel and the Middle East. And I speak as someone who considers himself a Zionist. I mean, I believe in the existence of Israel as a Jewish democracy, and believe very strongly that the only way that can be preserved is that there's a Palestinian state as well. Under the Trump administration and under the Netanyahu administration in Israel, efforts towards a two-state solution have been set back markedly. My hope is that in a Biden administration, we'll take a bit more of an even-handed approach, recognizing that Israel is our most important ally in the Middle East and a country that America has strong strategic and cultural ties, uh, but that American interests and Israeli interests are not the same. And sometimes Israel has to be pushed for its own good, to restrict settlement expansion and to be open to negotiations for a two-state solution. I'm not naive. I don't think this is around the corner. Not only do you have an Israeli government that is opposed to it, but you don't really have a partner on the other side. I mean, the Palestinian administration is hopelessly corrupt. Abbas is not the leader who's going to get us to a two-state solution, but nevertheless, you want to hold the opportunity for that to happen. You don't want to foreclose that. And I was concerned that the Trump administration was doing exactly that. More specifically, I think in a Biden administration, I don't think they're going to remove Jerusalem as Israel's capital, having America recognize Jerusalem as Israel's capital. Um, that move was done, and surprisingly, it elicited very little negative reaction across the Middle East. So I think that is a done deal. But my guess is the Biden administration will reach out more to the Palestinians, restore the consulate in East Jerusalem, provide financial aid to the Palestinians, and push back harder on the Israelis, making it clear that annexation is off the table, and that unbridled settlement expansion is not in America's interest and will be opposed by the United States. And you have now a significant portion of the Democratic Party that is openly hostile to Israel. And my guess is this will at least impede efforts to simply take the Israeli side on many issues. I don't support some of the more extreme views of the progressive wing of the Democratic Party, but it may create a sort of balance by which the United States could be seen as a more unbiased, balanced interlocutor, uh, paving the way for at least hopes for Middle East peace. And of course, you have the so-called outside in peace movement that Israel has now been recognized by several Arab countries, and Sudan is likely to be next. And the hope is that this may give Israel more confidence, perhaps with a different government, that it could move more strongly and fervently towards a two-state solution. Again, with a different set of characters, both on the Israeli side and on the Palestinian side. And then I think a Biden administration can move that process along.
To tell you the truth, I hope so. Yeah, a two-state solution could be the case. And as far as I have heard, you are quite hopeful, and you believe that Biden administration could bring peace to the Middle East with a two-state solution. This is
Yes,
what I
I
have
would
heard.
also add, since we're talking in Turkey, that the hope is that Erdogan might moderate some of his anti-Israeli rhetoric and serve more as a bridge towards a Middle East peace rather than an opponent of that.
Okay, so let's move on with the next question. My question is to Ambassador Thomas Pickering. The transatlantic relationship currently faces divergences on a number of important issues: Iran, climate change, tariffs on steel and aluminium, and the role of the multilateral institutions, the appointment of the World Trade Organization, and so on. And as regards security, President Trump has been known to have strong opinions on North Atlantic Treaty Organization, NATO. How do you think the new government will take on this legacy, and what kind of an approach will they adopt, in your opinion? And I would like to add on to Mr. David. Maybe Turkey in this way could act as a bridge between the two states and help to contribute to the peace in the Middle East. Turkey could also do it by supporting the Palestinian side as well as the Israeli side. So we're going to see, but hopes are high. So let's see. The floor is yours, Mr.
Thank you very much. Let me be brief because I think we're coming out of time. But I think with respect to the Europeans and what's going on there now, it is an opportunity for President-elect Biden to make a real change, to stop measuring contributions to defense solely in a percentage figure of national resources devoted to it. Although I don't think that that's wrong to encourage states in NATO to provide more in the direction of the 2% target. And I hope that that will be done. But I think that in many ways, the divisive aspects of that, the bilateral application of American interest in NATO toward one set of parameters in terms of contribution to defense does need to, in fact, be relooked at. I do think that NATO as a whole does need another look at, well, how much will it be an out of area support for activities primarily led by the United States as it was in Afghanistan? How much will it resile back into a question of Europe and European defense, particularly with the growing contention with Russia and obviously Russian intervention in Western Europe, with the idea of driving wedges between the United States and Europe as a whole, and particularly with relation to the former Warsaw Pact Central European countries that are now pretty firmly fixed in the European project. The European project itself, particularly with respect to the EU, is on parlous days. I think Brexit and where it will go will not contribute in a very serious way to how it moves. Britain played an important role in the EU, punching well above its weight, particularly in its efforts to unify, to standardize policy, even though it had its own disruptive influences, particularly in not joining further in things like European currency. But on the whole, I believe Britain was an important player and its absence will be strongly missed. Most importantly, I believe in London, where in effect, pulling out of Europe will have very serious economic consequences for the UK. And how and in what way the Biden administration chooses to deal with that will be an interesting challenge. Will it, as Britain hopes and Boris Johnson significantly wants to realize, pick up the pieces and substitute the American market for the European market, something that's not easily or readily done, and put us once again potentially in contention with the EU, a posture we've avoided? Or can we find a way to harmonize with Britain out of the EU in a way that will, in one way or another, continue to match what the EU is doing, which in the long run, the United States has tended to favor, particularly, I think, because imitation is a high form of flattery. But I also think because in many ways, the creation of a very large market is significant and important in that regard. Just a few words about that. President Erdogan in his future will be able to recognize that some European aspirations are still potentially alive, but unfortunately, not in my view through Turkey's fault so much as the fault of the Europeans who like to perhaps see themselves as a Christian-only club have made a serious mistake in dealing with Turkey. And that will not be easy to reverse, neither from the side of Ankara or the side of Brussels, if we can put it that way. One would hope that that would play a role because people saw Turkey as a very interesting country, a country that was potentially increasingly unitable with Europe on the one hand, but also because of the geography, played a very important potential balancing role in the Middle East. Its early relationship with Israel, now pretty much in tatters, but its continued relationship throughout the region with the Muslim states of the region was in many ways the kind of hope that's been expressed here just in the last few minutes for the future of Turkey and its role in the region. Unfortunately, that's not easy. Cyprus, oil resources in the Eastern Mediterranean, and many other places around the region have problems. I remember some years ago when we were looking at Turkey and had problems with almost every state around the region, I recalled something a Hungarian foreign minister said in the immediate aftermath of the Second World War. Hungary is the only country in the world completely surrounded by Hungarians. And Turkey was in many ways one of the few countries in the world in those days completely surrounded by problems. The latter, I think, is still unfortunately part of Turkey's challenge and part of President Erdogan's challenge. And one would hope that he would see, in fact, that his Western orientation would be an asset, even if, in fact, it may be harder and harder to sell to at least parts of the Turkish public who wish to adopt perhaps a more forward-leaning view about Turkey's Islamic vocation and Turkey's relationship to things like the Ikhwan al-Muslimin, the Muslim Brotherhood in the region. That's perhaps more than needs to be said, but it does raise two conclusions. Both Europe for the United States and Turkey for the United States is part of that multiplicity of challenge the Biden administration will have to address. The Biden administration will do so, I think, with respect, with honoring dignity, with the notion that contact and communication and constructive diplomacy can be useful, but at a time and with an understanding that this is increasingly a multipolar world, and that's not going to make things very easy to deal with, particularly if we considered our past, the fleeting moments when we were a unilateral superpower, and the passage of those moments has to be absorbed by the US as well in a new form of multilateral leadership.
Thank you, Mr. Ambassador Thomas Pickering. Mr. Berry, last few remarks, please, and then we will move on with the Q&A session. Mr. Ambassador John Berry, the floor is yours, sir.
Yeah, I think I'll just turn to the Pacific for a little bit, because some of the participants might, from the Atlas Grad Institute, might not be as familiar with some of most recent activities of what's going on. It's been fascinating to watch, what is often referred to as Chinese, wolf warrior diplomacy in its iteration in the past 3 to 4 years. A much more aggressive diplomatic stance. And Australia, a country that I'm remain pretty familiar with, is facing right now their largest economic trading partner for their country is China. Their largest investment partner is the United States, by far, well over $1 trillion, almost $1.5 trillion of US investment in Australia, job creation, et cetera. But their trading relationship, obviously almost all of their ore, almost all of their natural gas, almost all of their beef, their wine, their agricultural products, their baby milk, their largest market is China. And they have so far been able to manage the delicate balance between having the tensions between the United States and China, with their largest security partner being the United States. As you all know, Australia is part of the Five Eyes Partnership, very important to us, fought alongside the United States in every major military engagement since World War One, but also keenly, the Australians, their largest trading partner is China. Now that has been sort of unchallenged until this past year. And over the past year, and even now, this is a very current topical, it's literally getting hotter by the week. China has frozen coal and natural gas purchases. One of the things that I went and in Queensland in Australia is a major natural gas development project that had 3 partners in it, which was a great example of how the future could be. China, the United States, and Australia. And China, that project, both the Chinese ambassador and I, was the only project that I was able to do a joint appearance with the Chinese ambassador while I was ambassador, not from the United States perspective, but from the Chinese perspective. The only time he could get permission to appear with me in public and in the press was we visited that site. Well, just this past week, that site, they were looking to do a capital upgrade and China nixed it. So this is an indication. But let me take it farther. China has, is threatening now to freeze wine and beef, which would have a huge impact between the two countries economically. The fact that China is, 40% of their natural gas is coming from Australia, the fact that they're willing to move into this area and threaten to shut that valve off is a pretty good indication of just how assertive China is going to play with a connection between economics and security issues. And their ambassador, who's a much more aggressive ambassador than I had, a wonderful gentleman when I was there, and we were good friends and got along very well professionally. The current one is much more aggressive, but he's also, and one advantage is he's much more direct. And in his comments recently, it was, if you want these economic actions to change, there are 3 things Australia needs to do. And, Australia has prevented Huawei from coming into their country under the Five Eyes relationship. China says you need to lift that ban. Australia has strengthened their FIRB review, the financial investment review for investments that could affect the national security of Australia. That has gotten tougher in recent years in Australia, and China says that needs to be reversed. And third, there needs to be an entirely new tone. So you can see what is, now this is a pretty straightforward, approach. There's no gray about what's going on here. And what has up till now been played out behind the scenes with Vietnam and with Thailand and with India and Sri Lanka and other places throughout Indonesia, throughout the Indo-Pacific. This is pretty much drawing this front and center. And so I think it's an indication of that's going, this is, look, it's the largest growing economic region in the world. The United States needs to remain a major player here for our own economic health and for our own job creation. But this is, I cast sort of just the most recent information just to be aware of how steadily increasing the challenge and the tensions are growing, and directly among, obviously, a United States ally. So it's going to be an interesting challenge that we face. President Biden's coming in, every president comes in facing a whole set of challenges. President Biden's coming in with many a plate full, but no man has been better prepared to become president and put his hand on the Bible on January 20th than Joe Biden. And luckily, I think he's got both a firm grasp of all of the substance of all these issues. He will have an excellent team around him to help address these challenges. And I think he will be deft and bring his skills as both a unifier and, as Richard said, a deal maker, and hopefully finding a way to thread these needles. But they're going to become, as you can see in the discussion of what's going on in China and Australia right now, the eyes of the needle are getting narrower, not wider.
Thank you very much. We also hope that he's going to be a unifier and deal maker. Yes, I guess the world will need it. Yeah, especially in the midst of the pandemic. Now that we're in the midst of the pandemic, I hope a multilateral world will prevail. Yeah. So, Mr. Fontaine, last remarks, please. And you also said that it must have been difficult to interpret the first presidential debate. I must admit, it was kind of chaotic. Yeah. Thank you.
Yeah, so maybe I'll just add a couple of thoughts on transatlantic relations and the Middle East. So I think one of the things that the Biden administration is going to need to look at, it clearly wants to strengthen transatlantic ties with the NATO allies, move beyond some of the tensions of the Trump administration with the president's focus on burden sharing and NATO allies spending 2% of their GDP on defense and wishing to withdraw troops from Germany and so forth. And so I think the tone, what we've already seen in the phone calls that the president-elect has had with leaders in Europe, that the tone is very different, much more ordinary, shall we say, even almost boring, which is kind of refreshing, actually. After some of the drama of the past few years when it comes to engagements between our president and foreign leaders. But that said, there are some issues that the administration is going to have to deal with, one of which is the focus of European security. So you have the United States, which is certainly worried about Russia and increasingly focused on China, while you have Europe that also has to deal with terrorism in the Sahel and migrants coming across the Mediterranean from North Africa, and continued trouble in Syria and the Levant, and now tensions in the Eastern Med, including between Greece and Turkey, and the role of Cyprus, and then Belarus. And so the European neighborhood is more unsettled now than it's been in quite a while, precisely at the moment when the United States is hoping to spend more of its attention and resources in the Indo-Pacific. And so one of the challenges is going to be, how do you reconcile the potential divergence of at least focus, if not interest, between the United States and our European allies? And then, of course, the role of Turkey in all of this is challenging as well, because I think Washington is split on the question of the U.S.-Turkish relationship. On the one hand, there's concern about some of the Turkey's domestic policies and role in the region. On the other hand, Turkey is an ally of the United States, and the United States is an ally of Turkey. It sits at a very important place in the world and has played historically a strategically critical role. And like so many things, it's complicated. And so where the administration comes down on some of these questions of transatlantic security, on Turkey's role in how they think about U.S. foreign policy, remain question marks, and those are some of the challenges that are going to I think, confront them sooner rather than later when they take up power in January.
Thank you. Now that you have elaborated on the role of Turkey, do you think U.S. support for YPG in Syria will be changing, or will it continue with the President-elect Biden administration? And do you think this policy creates complex problems in the region?
Yeah, I mean, I am speculating here because I don't know, but I think that that U.S. Efforts to work with the Kurds in northern Syria are likely to continue because the alternative is worse, which is that ISIS, whose physical caliphate has been destroyed, but there are plenty of ISIS fighters who have gone to ground in places both in Iraq and in northern Syria, could make a comeback. So I think that the policy of continued American presence that supports both Kurdish and Arab fighters in at least northeast Syria is likely to continue. And on the question of does that cause problems? Yeah, of course. I mean, it causes problems in the relationship with Turkey for sure. This was a major consideration back years ago when Washington had to decide what to do here. On the one hand, you had this clear and present danger of a huge terrorist sanctuary and presence of ISIS that was threatening attacks on the United States and across Europe and among other allies. And you had Kurdish fighters that were aligned with the YPG who were there and willing to fight in the effort to beat back ISIS. On the other hand, this is precisely a group that government in Ankara believes is part and parcel of the PKK, and that has all of the problems for Turkey that one might imagine. Ultimately, the United States made the decision to go after ISIS, essentially with whatever means were necessary at the time. But certainly, it was not an easy choice to make, precisely because of the problems that inserts into the U.S.-Turkish relationship.
Thank you for your remarks. Mr. Stephen David, the floor is yours. Last remarks, please.
Yeah, where there seems to be a consensus, although I'm not sure if it's a justified consensus, is that the United States has to focus more on great power threats, threats from China, threats from Russia, and perhaps pay less attention to the developing world, avoid endless wars in the Middle East, etc. And while I'm of course sympathetic to that, let me add that most of the problems, certainly that have affected American interests since World War II, arguably have not come from great power conflict, but from instability and issues in what used to be called the third world and now we call the developing world. In fact, interstate war has declined markedly over time. The last great power war was World War II, over 75 years ago. This is the longest period of peace among great powers in recorded history. And I would argue that for all the problems America's going to face with Russia and China, the recognition that war would be suicidal with a nuclear armed adversary, and in the case with China, war would be economically catastrophic before the first shot was fired, will essentially keep the peace. I'm not so sure that's the case in problems from the developing world. What I worry about is that weak states and even individuals are now empowered to the extent to which they can do grievous harm. That with the availability of cyber warfare, biological warfare, chemical, artificial intelligence, where we're entering a world where the weak can, for the first time, inflict horrendous damage against the strong. And especially with COVID, which has tremendously hurt and reversed the progress that so many in the developing world had experienced, where now poverty and internal conflict are likely to become much more acute. We're facing many challenges that I hope America does not ignore with a hyper focus on, again, the Russian and Chinese threats. So we've got to keep a strong eye on that, and I'm hopeful that the Biden administration will do so.
Thank you very much. Is there a question from the audience? If there's a question, then we will return to that. Otherwise, we might wrap it up. Let me see. Okay. Okay, we can wrap it up. Okay. So thank you all very much for joining us this evening or this morning, wherever you reside. It was my... Yeah.
Could I make, we have a few minutes
Sure.
left.
Sure. Please go ahead, Mr. Ambassador. The floor is yours.
I agree very much with Stephen David's thoughts that it's too simple to pay only attention to the multi-power competition in which we are, by inevitable arrangements, clearly a major player. That secondly, resuming a world in which we have a unilateral role of certainty is something that I think is now past. We do need in the Biden administration to come off the notion, facile as it was and misleading as it has turned out, that military action is the best, easiest, and shortest way to solve diplomatic problems, despite the fact that diplomacy is uncertain, at many times messy, and certainly not a perfect answer. But it is, I think, clearly the first, not the last alternative that has to be used. The last alternative is force. And my own view is that force should be reserved for defense of ourselves and our allies, not something that has become a military operational activity. However, I do believe that the presence of a large military institution in the United States, as well as a strong economy, and many values and principles, many of which we have to get back to, put us in a very unique and significant position to lead in a multiplicity of contenders rather than necessarily be a unilateral focus for others. I finally think that there is no easy answer for the multiplicity of problems that arise under the new circumstances, circumstances the military call asymmetry. But in diplomacy, we can see the multiplication, as Professor David has said, of failing states, of deeply, put it this way, damaged economies, and that the virus is playing a great role in that. This means that we as a government need to do a better job. And in many ways, we need to bring together the various assets of a government like that of the United States in a way that builds much more symmetry and much more capacity to work together. The State Department doesn't have all the answers. The Defense Department doesn't have all the answers. Increasingly, other departments of government and other agencies of government have to play a role. We have struggled since 1947 in the national security system to do this. It is not adequate. It is not the answer. And we have not reached a view about how and in what way to assign responsibilities, both for bringing things together in one way, and secondly, doing a better operational job of implementing the separate responsibilities of agencies and departments in a cohesive way. Ambassador Berry, I think, will join me in recognizing that the one place the United States has to operate 24 hours a day, 7 days a week, 365 days a year in a kind of whole of government context is the American embassy and our institutions overseas. It's not a perfect answer, but in many ways it is part of a unique and interesting and perhaps lesson providing experience that we could look. President-elect Biden and his team will have an opportunity ever to address these questions remains very open. Much has been said about them, and I think it is important to pay attention to them, but they will, in the first 2 years of the new administration, I believe, assume a back seat because what comes in over the transom and what the president wants to do will in fact take pride of place. The second 2 years could be a period in which the president loses authority in Congress rather than gains it. And those are not times to address fundamental reorganizational problems. So reorganization and reform of an American government is sort of doomed in these days, unless a president like Biden wants to fish it out and to work on it. And I don't see at this moment any intention in that direction, but one would hope. But it is not to, in a sense, say the Biden administration will not be a breath of fresh air and a real significant opportunity to change things, even if we have in a very, very coordinated way here talked about the growing multiplicity of problems illuminated in some areas by brighter points of light than others. This is a Herculean task, and it will require the best of the United States. And my hope is that President Biden will have great opportunities to engage that in a situation which will be still very hard.
Thank you for your concluding remarks. As you have stated, Mr. Ambassador Thomas Pickering, the job of the new administration, the Biden administration, Biden-Kamala administration will be quite hard. And it looks as if they will have a busy agenda containing COVID, healthcare, climate change, economic recovery, the divided state, and foreign relations. So it looks as if, it remains to be seen whether cooperation or competition will prevail on foreign relations, and it remains to be seen whether the country will be more united under the Biden administration. However, as you have noted, Biden seems like a unifier and a deal maker. So I hope and we hope things will get better. Thank you all very much for joining us. And it was my pleasure to moderate this session. Thank you very much.